Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us a very special guest, Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar. Professor Chandrasekhar is a world-renowned Indian economist. He taught at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru, New Delhi, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi for more than 30 years. His area of interest includes the role of finance and industry in development, and the experience with fiscal, financial, and industrial policy reform in developing countries. Professor Chandrasekhar, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
It's such a pleasure to have you on. I want to jump right in with neoliberalism. We have been discussing a lot about what neoliberalism is, and I want to specifically address the issue of sovereign debt crisis that has become so systemic and widespread. If you can break down for us why countries after countries, Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, Zambia, Tunisia, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, why countries after countries are facing this crisis, and what is the link with changes in the global north?
Okay, well, two components to it. One is, of course, on neoliberalism itself. I don't want to get too much into the discussion on neoliberalism, but all I'd like to say is there's a tendency for advocates of neoliberalism to present it as being an effort to try and reduce the role of the state and enhance that of markets. Essentially, the whole idea is that freer markets would result in better allocation of resources. But we know in practice, and I think this needs to be emphasized, that one, the state does not retreat under neoliberalism. Two, markets are not free to operate. If at all, they can operate freely in any context under capitalism. But essentially, neoliberalism is a mechanism in which the state is restructured in order to ensure the transfer, the engineered transfer of income and wealth from the bottom deciles of the population to the top 5% of the population. So it's actually, in some sense, it's a class project which involves an engineered redistribution of income. So if you're looking at the issue of the crisis which now confronts, in particular the debt crisis which confronts a number of less developed countries, it is in some sense, in a proximate sense, the consequence of neoliberalism and this effort, as I said, to engineer redistribution of income. But we have to place this in sort of historical context, in the context of the nature of the unequal international global order, which we've had for much longer than the period which is identified with neoliberalism per se. And that structural context is one in which we had the evolution over a period of time as part of the process of capital accumulation in the metropolitan countries. We had the evolution of an international order in which a set of countries, which is the global majority, as it were located at the losing end of what was an unequal order, both in trade as well as in the consequences of foreign capital flows. Okay. And in part, this not merely came from the fact that at any given point of time, these countries were at the sort of subordinate and unequal pole of this unequal order, but it also came because of the fact that resulted in an inability to be able to ensure the structural transformation needed for a developmental transition, needed for a situation in which these countries could escape underdevelopment or backwardness, whatever you want to call it, and join the club of advanced nations or developed nations, the way you want to put it. We have exceptions, of course, but the exceptions are few. Firstly, the two principal exceptions in terms of countries are South Korea and Taiwan. It's not really, countries like Singapore and Hong Kong are not at the same level. In any case, Hong Kong is now not a country in itself, never was in some sense. So if you look at those two countries, they had a very special relationship with the United States, not merely because of the fact that they saw a lot of transition under US occupation, but they played an extremely important role during the period in which the United States was involved in the Vietnam War, and therefore had a special relationship and had a sort of almost an implicit sovereign guarantee of the US state when they went into international markets. But if you take the other countries, because of that structural imbalance, they were characterized by chronic current account deficits, and these chronic current account deficits had to be financed. And the way they financed them was, of course, to a certain extent, it was financed by whatever was the amount of foreign capital which came in the form of foreign direct investment into these countries. But primarily, in terms of having some degree of flexibility, this was in terms of trying to borrow their way out of these balance of payments difficulties. But at that point of time, all borrowing was basically through bilateral and multilateral channels because developing countries were not considered safe enough for foreign private creditors to enter these economies till about the
This
1980s.
this is prior to the 70s to 90s period.
Before, prior to the 80s, I would say.
80s, right?
So in some sense, at that point of time, even though this vulnerability existed, this vulnerability was actually, to a certain extent, self-correcting, not in the interests of the developing countries, but definitely self-correcting. And the mechanism of self-correction was that since both foreign aid through bilateral and multilateral channels and foreign direct investment was determined from the supply side, from the objectives and interests of either foreign investors or of foreign metropolitan states. And therefore, it was not that you could pick up your phone and call, New York or London and say that, listen, I want $3 billion and get it. That's not the way it worked. There was a certain amount. And if you exceeded, your current account deficit exceeded what you could access, you faced a balance of payments crisis. You went to the IMF. The IMF imposed austerity. You had to contract. And therefore, you couldn't actually be in a situation where you were perennially, not merely characterized by uh, current account deficits, but you're perennially in a state of accumulating debt. Now that began to happen in the neoliberal period. That began to happen when we had in developed metropolitan capitalist economies, we had a crisis in the late 1960s, which saw the dismantling of structures which, in some sense, reined in finance and favored industrial capital. All of that changed. In specifically, if you take the United States, the whole Glass-Steagall framework of regulation of finance just collapsed because the United States was one country in which the regulation of finance was the most stringent,
Correct.
and that too during the period of the golden age,
Right.
when the United States actually registered good growth, low unemployment, very low inflation, and has never seen that either before or after,
And the
excepting for
Great
those. Huh?
the Great Depression was a sort of
It was a
primary
turning point,
cause.
but the
Yeah.
point is between having precipitated the banking crisis and therefore Glass-Steagall,
Right.
we actually entered a period, particularly after the Second World War, which was important from the point of view of getting out of the Great Depression. But we entered a period in which we had the Golden Age.
Right.
And even during the Golden Age, you actually had this stringent regulation of finance. You reigned in finance. It was really the breakdown of the Golden Age, which resulted in a situation where you had inflation which you could not control for multiple reasons, which I want to go into, that you had the rise to dominance of finance. Now, once you had the rise to dominance of finance, even sort of what could be called extraneous developments, triggered processes. So if you had an oil crisis, I'm sorry, oil shocks, the surpluses which the oil exporters got out of the oil shocks were deposited in the international banking system, and these banks had control about how they were allocated. The pension funds, which were looking for ways of investing the savings of the baby boomer generation, which had come into the labor market, were looking for places to invest. And of course, the United States, as Tobin put it, behaved as if they had a mint in their backyard because they were the home of the reserve currency. The dollar was as good as gold, and they could spend without any national budget constraint. Now, this obviously resulted in this huge amount of capital with private finance, not merely commercial banks, but subsequently a whole range of institutions, which were looking for new destinations. You couldn't only lend within the metropolitan countries.
Right.
And that's when the emerging markets and uh, frontier markets were discovered. And this essentially meant that you were in a world in which now there was a supply side push of capital as opposed to a supply side control of capital. You had a supply side push of capital into the so-called less developed, underdeveloped countries. And when you had that supply side push of capital, obviously governments began to behave as if current account deficits did not matter because you could always finance them, they thought.
Correct.
And of course, if you have delinquent governments, rogue leaders, they could use the opportunity to borrow, to undertake huge expenditures to enhance their prestige, win legitimacy. At least they thought so, and that accumulated large volumes of debt. Now, this was not merely not self-correcting, because it was now in the interest. It was now in the interest of global finance to have these countries continuing to borrow,
Right.
because they needed to keep this capital moving. And this only increased when, after the 2008 crisis, in response to the crisis, central banks injected huge volumes of cheap liquidity into the system. I mean, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve went up from 800 billion to very quickly to something like 14 trillion. And now, of course, it's gone up even further because of COVID expenditures.
Right.
So you had this huge amount of dollar liquidity coming into the system, which too was being mediated substantially through private global finance. And therefore, you never have a crisis which ends with access to credit being cut off completely. I mean, for these developing countries, you only have the IMF coming and forcing these countries to do certain things such that the losses incurred by global finance, which had already made huge profits because of the huge interest rates and yields at which they invested or lent to these countries, to actually go back without taking too large a haircut. That is the role of the IMF. So if you look at it, I mean, just look at it now. If you're supposed to be in a world of a debt crisis, but suddenly emerging market bond markets are reviving. I mean, Kenya is borrowing, El Salvador is borrowing. I mean, there are a large number of countries which are coming back to market and getting money.
They are borrowing mostly from the Eurobonds and
Yeah, that's right.
ins
Which is basically private capital.
right.
Okay, private investors, fund managers, commercial banks, etc. So you'd never have a situation where, so for example, when the 1997 Southeast Asian crisis occurred, people said, that's it. Now these countries are not going to get free access to capital. Willy-nilly, we know that the huge amounts of flows have been occurring to Thailand, to Indonesia, to Malaysia, besides, of course, South Korea and so on. So it basically, then once you have, this link between neoliberalism, which is the emergence of an order in which you use the state to engineer profit inflation, and that is accompanied, or in fact is partly the result of the rise to dominance of finance post the 1960s crisis of global capitalism, then it becomes inevitable that one of the forms in which you extract surpluses from developing countries becomes not merely getting them indebted and debt trapped, but actually making sure that they're constantly repaying reasonable amounts so that you can go back to these countries, because their presence is crucial for profit making on the part of global finance. And I see the crisis that you're talking about as essentially reflective of that.
Right. I wanted to ask you a little bit about talks of BRICS Bank or the PRC coming in as an alternative to push for some international debt resolution mechanism. I don't know if you have covered it, but I've seen recently in the African media. I mean, interestingly, the Financial Times hasn't covered this at all, but the African press has covered about the PRC writing off some unspecified amount of loans to Zimbabwe. There's a lot of talks about de-dollarization and so on. So there are talks about alternatives to the IMF-led order, which has essentially become a sort of debt collecting institution for the global lenders. How hopeful are you that, and what are the impediments for along those directions?
The fact is that there is a greater degree of plurality now than you had, let us say, at the end of the era when the Soviet Union mattered. I mean, we then saw a period in which plurality seemed to have collapsed. There was no inter-imperialist rivalry to speak of. There was no Soviet Union. But compared with that, you not only have, of course, China, which has become an extremely important player, but you also have a set of countries without being as dependent or as much client states of, let's say, the United States or some country in Europe, are still in a position where they're able to have a voice, not an influence, I'll say, but have a voice in the international order. Okay. Now there are two or three problems when we try and transit from that to try and say that there is some set of alternatives emerging within the global order. The first one which comes is because of the fact that we don't have, this is not some kind of a unified opposition to the US and its allies. I mean, that coalition. It basically, they're characterized as not only between, let's say, a China and an India, or China and a Philippines, or whatever it is. It's also between Japan and China, and Japan and South Korea and South, I mean, there are so many now, and also in Latin America. So when you have a situation of that kind, what we find is when countries come together without the United States sometimes, or without the United States and its allies, as in the case of the BRICS Bank, for example, that you would expect that they would then have a completely different set of norms when they seek to mobilize, that is, to leverage their contributions, to mobilize resources, to lend to countries which are externally, or balance payments, foreign currency strapped. Okay. But what we found is with the Chiang Mai initiative, for example, or the BRIC, or the contingent reserve facility, which was created along with the BRICS Bank, is that because none of these members of these sort of loose coalitions wants to give power to anybody else within that coalition because of the tensions within, you very often find that the sort of surveillance mechanism which they try and construct as part of their effort to enter into the global, let's say, the global lending environment, or scenario, is the IMF. So if you want to get a certain money beyond a certain amount, either through the Chiang Mai initiative swaps, or through the contingent reserve facility, etc., you find that the way what you need to do, if you go beyond the little amount, is you have to then already be involved in an IMF program where the IMF is the surveillance agent. Now, that obviously means that this is not an alternative at all. In fact, what really happened in the case of the Chiang Mai initiative is countries just didn't go to Chiang Mai. They said that, listen, if we have to, in any case, accept IMF surveillance, we might as well go directly to the IMF, and possibly that gives us more access to international markets than coming to you. So, so it was a failure. So that's the first one. The second one is that in in most contexts, we are not talking about a situation of the kind which existed where the reserves which countries have, like in the case of China, a large part of China's foreign exchange reserves are earned reserves. It comes because of current account surpluses that they had held at different points of time. But most our that is true also in South Korea, and different phases of its history. But in most countries, like for example India, current account surpluses, I'm sorry, foreign exchange reserves are associated with consistent current account deficits.
Right.
So this means that this is not these reserves reflect liabilities. They don't reflect earnings, because you've actually had foreign capital inflows, either in the form of debt to bond markets, etc., or into your equity markets, wherever, which have the right to exit, which is accumulated as your reserves. So there's a limit to which you can actually outlay this to save others. So at most, it can be a temporary arrangement, because of the fact, a temporary swap, because of the fact that you need these reserves, because there is the danger that there would be an outflow as a result of this. And the third thing is that it is true what you say about China, that China has had, in most circumstances, where it deals directly with the debtor government. It has, of course. This is not to say that it's altruistic, or it's not, it's pursuing its own, not merely commercial, but also substantially its strategic interests. I mean, all of them do. So why expect China not to do that? Okay. But the real issue has become that since countries, even when they are bilaterally principally indebted to China, are hugely exposed to private foreign creditors, that you really are in a situation in which resolving a problem partially or even more than partially vis-a-vis China doesn't get you out of your crisis. But on the other hand, private creditors are only willing to accept the IMF and the Paris Club as its front end and are not willing to accept the Chinese. So the whole system has become, the common framework, etc., has become a system where you're putting pressure on China, which is basically saying that, listen, I mean, why should I accept your terms? Why should I accept what an IMF's debt sustainability assessment says when I have no control over the IMF? You control the IMF. Why should I accept the terms which you're setting for bilateral creditors when you don't get multilateral creditors, which is the principal channel through which your money goes? Because there's very little bilateral credit now from the Paris Club. Most of the money from those countries goes through multilateral channels like the World Bank. But you say the World Bank will never take a haircut because it'll lose its AAA rating, and that's bad. So China is saying, so you're in a situation where we find in most cases, the pressure is exerted till finally China, because it feels odd, letting this country hang like that, that it actually goes and gives its financing assurances. So it's not in a position to be able to resort to its power because its own resolving its own credit, I mean its own debt, the debt it holds, doesn't actually resolve the crisis, because even if bilateral credit from others is not important, multilateral credit and credit from foreign creditors is important, resulting in a situation where this plurality, for this third reason as well, cannot actually assert itself.
I think I want to wrap up this segment with a little bit of discussion from your article on the Sri Lankan case. I don't want to discuss the Sri Lankan case as such, but one of the things I think is very important is the distinction that you made between international debt and domestic debt, and how the IMF, having clubbed them together, has created this narrative about public debt financing, and that leads to massive underfunding of the social sector and so on and so forth. So if you can tell us a little bit about these two mechanisms and explain how IMF manufactures austerity in these countries.
Yeah, okay. So very quickly, first we must realize that you know the IMF defines the difference between domestic and external debt as essentially being: debt is domestic when it falls under domestic law, debt is foreign when it falls under foreign law. Whereas the way in which you normally would tend to uh, make the distinction is to say that external debt is held in hard currency, is denominated in hard currency, and is normally to non-residents. There are exceptions, but they are very small proportion even when there are exceptions. Okay. So it's predominantly non-resident and foreign currency debt. Domestic debt is predominantly resident, including the state. Okay. And is denominated in the domestic currency. Now, normally, when we talk about debt crisis and debt restructuring, we're talking about sovereign debt. So you're basically saying that I am going to look at unsustainable debt by clubbing together both these kinds of debt, because that's what matters. That there is this, whatever, profligacy, whatever you want to call it. That completely undermines the fact that, listen, if I want to service my domestic debt, first, I am a state, I have the right to tax. Two, I have greater control, I have certain degree of monetary sovereignty through my central bank. I can actually virtually print money and repay debt. I can change the laws with regard to domestic debt. I can't change the laws with regard to foreign debt.
Right.
Maybe the New York's, there can be a bill in New York or in London, but not in the borrowing country. So what we're basically saying is that there is a far greater degree of control that you have over servicing your domestic debt, besides the fact that it's. And third, of course, there is the fact that servicing foreign debt basically means that even if you have domestic resources, you'll have to transform those domestic resources into foreign exchange. And that has to be done through a process of transformation through trade. Because you cannot do it by basically saying, hey, you hold my my currency and give me your dollars. Yeah, people will say, why should I hold your currency? I don't, I mean, it's even when currencies claim they're convertible, they are at most partially convertible compared to the hard currencies, particularly the US dollar. So, given all of that, there is a fundamental problem here now. But what this results in, or not results in, what this helps the IMF do is it helps the IMF say that what needs to be resolved is when you're resolving a debt crisis, is to reduce the gross financing needs of that country over the period in which it is under an IMF program. And the gross financing need basically would mean that which is required to service past debt, plus the additional borrowing you need to undertake in order to meet expenditures that you would during this period to put yourself back onto a growth path or whatever it may be. Now, therefore, what you're saying is here again, you don't make no difference. And therefore, you say that, listen, if you're going to reduce your gross financing needs, what you need to do is reduce your aggregate debt. So you need to not only restructure foreign debt, external debt, but you need to restructure your domestic debt as well. Now, restructuring foreign debt requires dealing with powerful players in international markets, besides bilateral creditors, of course. Whereas restructuring domestic debt has got to do with dealing with your own domestic institutions. So it becomes much easier to do that. So that's what happens first once you begin this process. So if you look at it in the past, historically, you know, this whole question of domestic debt restructuring was not an issue at all. It didn't even feature very often. I mean, it was there, but I think, there's something like out of an IMF survey found that out of 100, I forget the exact number, let's say about 170 cases, there were about 30 cases of domestic debt restructuring pure. And even that were in very poor countries, in low income countries. So that's because of the fact that they had other problems which they had to deal with. The state was not in a position to tax, maybe the state was not in. So given all of that, you're essentially saying that, okay, you're trying to actually get the governments to do this first. That's what you do in Ghana, or you did in Ghana. That's what you did in Sri Lanka. And when you do that, the question you ask is, okay, so what happens? Supposing I restructure my domestic debt. You say, okay, that creates the confidence among international investors that, now they can come, I mean, lenders, that they can come and restructure their debt. But why should it give you confidence? How do I convert this? Even if it says, supposing I say that it releases some money besides the recession, etc., it will create. So supposing still it releases some money. How could I convert that money into foreign exchange? If I had the ability to convert it into foreign exchange, I wouldn't have got into this debt problem earlier. I would have serviced my external debt because the crisis normally comes when you don't service, you default on your external debt payments. It doesn't come because you default on your domestic debt payments. Now, therefore, the only thing one can say is that, listen, I mean, why? What is the logic of the IMF? And I think the only ways in which you can explain this is one, you basically say that there is a reduction which you're trying to ensure. I mean, in GDP, a contraction in GDP, which will reduce your imports. Because if you say, oh, that will release goods which can be exported, then the presumption is that you didn't have excess capacity in those sectors. Because if you had excess capacity in those sectors, even without a contraction, you could export it. Right. So you basically are saying that you reduce your imports because associated with any level of output is a certain amount of imports for production and consumption. You squeeze your imports to release foreign exchange resources or save foreign exchange resources to pay back your foreign lenders. Or you're basically trying to say that I have a situation where a government basically says that, listen, I've made my pension funds, my commercial banks, etc., to take a cut, but now I can't do this anymore. So therefore, what I need to do is put on the table a set of assets which I can directly convert into foreign exchange. So I privatize public assets. I give access to my forests, whatever it may be. I do certain things where I can actually directly earn foreign exchange by selling assets.
Through the equity market.
Sorry?
Through the equity market.
Oh no, or you have a direct sale. I mean, you
Direct sale.
say, okay, you have a divestment, but where you basically say the divestment is only to foreign buyers because I need foreign
in
exchange.
Latin America and such
Yeah,
places.
that's right. So basically, the logic of the IMF is not clear at all. It's only this sort of indirect logic where a severe squeeze or severe austerity releases foreign exchange because you're not able to import. Because the only other case where we can identify a situation in which you can say that foreign investors or lenders became happy after austerity was Greece. But then Greece did not borrow in a separate currency because Greece was part of the Eurozone. So we know now that the Greeks are in terrible state, but the Greek economy is supposedly recovering, and foreign creditors are coming back. So other than that, when you have a hierarchy of currencies, this actually is nothing but, in the final analysis, a case for forcing countries to either release resources which are crucial, uh, or curtail imports through severe austerity in order to ensure that the haircuts taken by foreign creditors is very small.
I think this is a good segue into discussing agriculture and, if possible, industry a little bit, because we are talking about instability in current account, and that has to do a lot with your power to export, whether it's agriculture commodity or industrial commodities. If we could start with agriculture, and again, I don't want to go into the detail of your paper that you wrote recently about the three farm bills, but I think a critical point that you made there is that the problem essentially is that since the 1990s, there has been an adverse turn of balance of trade against agriculture due to a whole range of changes, essentially the service sector going up, but also industries relying more and more on non-agricultural inputs, leading to a situation where remuneration for farm products has become very low. And that is coupled with a fiscal conservatism that doesn't allow governments to come in and subsidize small cultivators. And I think this is not just an Indian problem. I mean, multiple reports from the Financial Times on cocoa planters in Ivory Coast and Ghana, that on one hand, chocolate prices are going up the roof, and on the other hand, cocoa planters don't get anything. Tell us a little bit about this problem of adverse balance of trade against agriculture, and is there a way to reverse that?
Okay, so you basically have, let's say you have a long run tendency where, which the structuralists etc. had pointed out, where in I mean, not only in the domestic arena, but particularly in global trade, you know, primary products were at the losing end of international trade. Okay, because as incomes went up, demand diversified away from those kinds of commodities. You found synthetic substitutes for many inputs and so on and so forth. So there's that long-term tendency that that if you're a primary producer, you possibly are at the losing end as development occurs. But of course, there would be periods when, if there's a sudden spurt in growth in the international economy, that would give you demand. So you can have these cycles.
Like the
But
Brazilian miracle of the early
huh?
2000s, like the
Yeah,
Brazilian
exactly.
case of early 2000s,
The whole the
whole
whole
Latin America.
first pink wave in Latin America
Yeah.
was during the commodity super cycle. Okay, so you seem to but basically you have this larger tendency. But I think what happened what happened with capital accumulation in a long term sense also is that the changing structure of capitalism over a period of time, where you moved one into more metal and chemical based industries, and two, you diversified into services, in particular into financial services and business services. When you have that kind of a transition, then what you're saying is that the agricultural input intensity of of agricultural intensity of a given level of domestic production is gets to be lower. And if it gets to be lower, then you end up with a situation where you don't have as much demand for these commodities as you would have had associated with a given rate of growth of GDP. Okay. Now, to take this further, what really happens then is, once you enter the neoliberal era, you have a situation in which you have increasingly a set of supports which are either implicitly or explicitly given for agriculture, like subsidies for electricity, for example, used in agriculture, or if you say that there's
Fertilizer.
fertilizers and so on, that these tend to be cut over a period of time. And if they are cut over a period of time, you would end up with a situation where, you know, you're losing out on the cost front. Your costs are going up. And simultaneously, this happens to be a situation where, because of those kinds of demand effects and other factors, including the loss of support from the state to provide flows to the prices of primary commodities, in particular agricultural commodities, both at the international level in terms of commodity price stabilization, or like the minimum support price, which is afforded to farmers in India. So you get squeezed between rising costs and an inadequate increase in prices. And put all of this together, and you're basically saying that the viability of crop production is under challenge. But on top of that, if you have the entry of agribusiness into this arena, now entry of agribusiness basically says that you have a situation where you have, fragmented large numbers of farmers who enter into contracts with this sort of monopolistic buyer, and you therefore end up with a situation where the margins which are expropriated from these producers, and this can be commercial crops where it's been known for long, but it need not be only commercial crops. It can even happen, as farmers in India fear would happen. It could happen even in the case of, so you have a loss of viability of crop production as an underlying. So one is, you have the basic fact that agriculture is normally at the losing end and therefore needs to be state protected. Then you have the fact that you have a certain loss of viability of crop production, which comes because of the nature of capital accumulation and the coming of neoliberalism. And finally, you have the entry of agribusiness as part of this whole, greater role for private capital as part of the effort at engineering the transfer of income and wealth to the rich. That you end up with a situation where you have a crisis. Now, this crisis is also, I think I should end by saying that this crisis also has to be placed in the context where, in any case, we are in a world of deflation, where basically you have substantial
And
numbers.
more so for the wholesale price than consumer price, right?
That's the margin element, yeah,
Right. Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, more so because the consumers pay what is post what the traders take, or the multinationals take, or
Right.
whatever it may be. I mean, so yeah. So the point is that there's also this larger deflation. So when the deflation doesn't affect profits, but it affects incomes, which affects demand for food,
Right.
oh, agricultural commodities and allied commodities.
I think this brings me to this combined question of let's say our vision for capitalism post neoliberalism, if at all we are entering post neoliberalism. And I wanted to uh, pivot the question specifically on industry and agriculture, because the Keynesian industrial capitalism that you referred to earlier had this, whether it's in the developed nations or the developing world, there was this assumption that industry is this sort of the levers of growth. Countries couldn't do that, but that was the assumption that we should be able to do that. But with climate change, we are told now that there is a very sharp limit to that path. So if we have a very sharp limits to growth and industry, how do you see the future of industries in our post neoliberal capitalism, and what is probably the place of should there be a greater reliance on small agriculture going forward?
You know, the first thing I'd like to say is that, other than for some stray examples, maybe Holland and so on and so forth, which anyway has very complex economic structure. Yeah, one cannot think of a country in which you can
Did
get to a
not have.
reasonable level of employment without having gone through at least a certain degree of development of industry. So it depends on which country you're talking about. If you say that if you say that you're really going to uh, try and improve the standard of living of your population, and through creating decent work or decent employment, and not putting all of them into an informal sector which it becomes a sink for the unemployed, really, and now it's not really decent work, then a certain degree of industrialization, I think
Should be
history
there.
seems to suggest, is necessary. So we have to look at which country we're looking at Two, this doesn't mean that this industrialization should be as polluting as earlier. You can actually retrofit in many senses, even power production, which enters in and so on and so forth, to actually make it less harmful and less than might have been the case earlier. The third is, of course, in the final analysis, it doesn't appear that you can actually get to sticking within a carbon budget, which would mean 1.5 or 2, without some negative, significant negative. I mean, that way, this whole idea of net zero is actually diversionary. What we need is significant negative, at least in some contexts, so creating the carbon budget for others to be able to undertake this. And finally, of course, there is a fact that, okay, you may not rely as much on industry. You need a certain amount of industry to create the structural context in which employment increases, but then you should try and think of productivity increases, which allows you to give greater weight to services and care and areas like that. So yeah, we're going to see a significant change in the composition of unemployment. I'm sorry, of employment. But for countries which, let's say, are still stuck at something like, without having gone up and come back down, stuck at something like 15% of GDP being from manufacturing, there doesn't seem to be enough weighty evidence now, excepting in exceptional cases, that you can actually generate a labor market which can ensure a reasonable degree of livelihood to those who participate. Now, if you can you that if earlier you said that you have to get to, let's say, 35%, maybe you can manage with 25%, or maybe whatever it may be, because you have the advantage of making industry different. But I do think you can't completely write off industry unless something massive happens in terms of the way people live and consume and so on and so forth.
Right. So 2 points essentially. One is perhaps a lower limit than 40%, 50%. And secondly, industrialization shouldn't be as polluting as it used to be.
Yeah, both directly and indirectly.
Right. I think this brings me to a slightly separate question, but not as separate. We have 15 minutes, so I would like to be as efficient. I'm talking to an economist, so efficiency is very important. I'm just kidding. I want to discuss the welfare state as it stands. I mean, in Africa, in Asia, there has been a lot of talks about the cash transfer, the direct benefit transfer, the cash transfer. And there are arguments on both sides. I mean, there are people on the, let's, for the lack of a better word, say far left, who are very critical of the cash transfer because they say that it essentially comes from within the neoliberal package, and it's just, allowing a little bit of cash in an economy which is very much dependent on market, doesn't allow you to improve massively in terms of your standard of living. And then there's the other side, including people like Abhijit Banerjee and others, who says that actually they can be very critical given how much of reliance is on market, whether it's about gender empowerment or ensuring nutrition and so on. What's your position on direct benefit transfer?
Firstly, there's one thing about development we must realize. Development is a problem of real resources. It's not a question of cash. I mean, there is a financial element to call capitalist economies. But when you say what is the constraint on development, the constraint on development is the absence of real resources of different kinds. So the capital stock required to employ a labor force might not be adequate. That's what Mahalanobis thought. Or it could be that the wage goods that you're producing is not enough to be able to sustain a transfer of a population from agriculture to non-agriculture, where you produce things which you can't eat without generating inflation, which subverts the developmental process. Or it could be that you need intermediates, and if you don't have intermediates, you'd end up with a situation where you'll be importing so much of your intermediates to produce your final goods. So it's the constraints on development are finally real material constraints. Okay, So in that context, if you define what a welfare state should be, you'd say that, okay, I have certain requirements. And by material, it need not even be good. I mean, I need education, for example. I mean, so I would say we should define a welfare state in being a state which is able to ensure a certain minimum access for all in a country of a certain set of things. So it could be health, it could be nutrition, it could be education, plus, et cetera, et cetera. So you must have access to all of this. Now we come to the situation, okay, how do I access it? One way in which I can access it is a lot of it basically is provided for me by the state, which invests in creating the facilities and gives it to me free of charge, maybe. Allows me to go to send my kids to school without paying any money. And they're reasonably good schools with decent infrastructure. That's one way. And so you can say that a large part of a welfare state is a state which actually creates the infrastructure required to provide these basic services. And you can think of a number of them, 6, 7 of them, which are including, of course, employment. I mean, I must have some money because not everything is provided by the state. So I have to have a certain amount of employment, which I go to the market to be able to access. Okay. Now, the whole thing about this, so defining a welfare state like that, then you can tell me that, listen, okay, these are the ways in which I'm going to ensure that there's access to all of this, either directly by the provision of the state or indirectly by the provision of employment and incomes through which they can access it through markets or whatever. This is how I'm going to ensure it. Now, as opposed to it, if I say that, listen, I'll give you, you know, what about $700 a month or something, and that then you go and buy yourself into this. First, of course, you're not guaranteeing supply. Two, you're not guaranteeing quality, and most crucially, you're not guaranteeing price.
Right.
So I can start with the $700, which even if it goes up to $100, might actually give me half of what I used to get when I got my $700, and even that might not be everything which I need.
Right.
So this is completely, I think, completely diversionary to actually just focus on income or cash. What needs to be done is to say that this is what you have to give people. And of course, it just isn't a certain sum of this or certain years of this or certain, access to these kinds of services, but implicit in it is also quality. And you can say that I'm going to give schools to children without any classrooms and without teachers, then there's no schools. So the point is, I think that intrinsically this is not capturing what's the fundamental problem of development. But more crucially, all this came really with neoliberalism. And it's a way of substituting state expenditures funded through taxation with a certain amount of state expenditure in the form of cash.
Right.
Because then you can say that, oh, then the debate becomes how much cash. It's not really saying, how much does the state need to mobilize in terms of resources to undertake the activities that it must undertake. So that's the way I would see it. So I think that it's completely diversionary, and it's a way of actually undermining even what thus far people have got from states which have been undertaking activities to provide a degree of welfare, social services, social protection, etc.
Also, this has, in some ways, it has moved away from a relatively more universal idea of welfare to a more what is
Well,
called as a
the cash
targeted.
transfer, people might tell you that it's universal, give it to everybody. I mean, or you can say,
Yeah, but I mean, if
or you can
like,
do a Modi and say
I
that,
mean,
you opt out of it if you're rich, but otherwise,
I'm thinking about education and health. I mean, even if
it
you
has to
or
be
I,
universal. Of course, it has to be
I mean,
universal.
but through cash transfer, it's not universal, because even if I get like 1,000 rupees and a poor peasants get thousand rupees, I would not go to a civil hospital. I can still supplement it with my own income and
Yeah,
still
yeah,
go
yeah,
to
yeah, yeah,
the
yeah, yeah, yeah.
the
Yeah,
corporate
that's true. Yeah,
hospitals.
that's true. The meaning,
And
there is no parity at all. No.
right. I think we're coming to an end. I wanted to ask you two quick questions, and if you can be a little bit concise, we can cover them up. There is a lot of talk about China now and where to place it, I mean, geopolitically, it is still placed by most people on the left as with the global South because of the whole military alliance and geopolitical alliance against China, and that's right. But when one thinks about China to an economic lens, it seems to me that China has escaped, or China doesn't have the constraints that actually are the constraints of the global majority, whether it is the problem of current account deficit or low productivity in agriculture and industries and so on and so forth. You, as an economist who focus on the global South, how do you look at China?
If you look at it I mean, Chinese themselves, whatever sort of adjective they might add to it, Chinese themselves see themselves now as a market economy. In any case, once they joined the WTO and so on and so forth, accepted a certain set of conditions, they were saying that, that's what they wanted to do. But I mean, there are a few things which you have to take into. One, of course, we have to take into account the fact that still there is a significant degree of public ownership over assets in China. Two, we know that uh, the influence of the Chinese state in making decisions, I mean, or getting decisions made, even by private players in China, and the support it provides to those private players whom it favors. Now, you can say this is like the South Korean developmental state, but the point is, the fact of the matter is that the Chinese government, state, administration, Communist Party, whatever you might call it, has a considerable influence on deciding, you know, what is going to be allowed in terms of investments and growth over a period of time. And if you, of course, there's this tendency that you swerve in one direction too much and then you pull it back and everybody says, oh, look at it and so on. But that's, and the third is, of course, that you haven't managed to ensure, I mean, you meaning the imperial, imperial powers, haven't been able to ensure in China what they managed to do in Russia, which is to undermine and dismantle the Communist Party.
Sure.
So given that, I mean, China is not an animal which can be put into either, a capitalist camp or a socialist camp or anything like that. It is something which is now become, you know, a thing in itself. And we have to analyze it like that, which has its own commercial interests, which has its own strategic interests, and which it pursues. But as I said, what that does is it puts a significant degree of plurality into the international system, more so because of the fact that whatever you might say, I mean, growth has slowed down in China, it's only 5%. 5% is a hell of a
5%
lot,
huge.
for an economy which has reached the dimensions it has reached. 5% is a hell of a lot. And we know that in crucial areas of technology, I mean, it's not just ahead, it's actually the leader. So given all of that, yeah, I wouldn't want to get into this whole discussion of is it capitalist or is it
No,
socialist.
no, no.
That's
Yeah.
not this. It's not a um, typical, well, whatever it is, semi-advanced capitalist economy. It's not. Two, it's definitely not a country which is pursuing altruism within a socialist framework. It has national interests which are both strategic and commercial. But three, its presence definitely makes a difference to the way the world economy functions and the impact that it has on countries which are not as part in the dominant sections of the world system.
I'll leave you with the last question. And I thought I would ask you about the transition from a more heterodox kind of economic thinking towards a discipline of economics dominated by neoclassical economic thinking. But I think I would not
That's
ask you that.
that's that's a long
Yeah, I think I would not
discussion.
ask you that question. I would ask you a more important question, which is we do on our podcast, which is to make economic thinking more intelligible to people who didn't necessarily go to grad schools. I mean, this is something I often think about, that probably this is true for all disciplines. I mean, every discipline has professionalized it, has put it in a lexicon that it is impenetrable to people at large. But economics is particularly perverse in the sense that it's very, very important for our well-being, and that is coupled with the decline of trade unions and so on, which has essentially left people believe that this is something not for us. questions of monetary policy, questions of banking, and so on are not reachable to our mind. What did you say we can do to make economic thinking more accessible to people who didn't necessarily go to economics grad schools like you did?
Well, I suppose, I mean, when one okay, I've always said that one of the difficulties we face is that the way in which the sort of mainstream or the neoliberals phrase their economic reasoning, it's so simple and simplistic that you know everybody thinks that they understand what is being said, but actually what is being said is a lot of trash. Okay, so whereas if you actually, if you if you want to explain what some of the mechanisms through which capitalism sort of moves forward or influences the lives of people, etc. Some of those mechanisms involve some thinking, but so the thing is not to say that we then simplify it in a fashion in which we completely get rid of the core insights, but to find ways of actually explaining those insights, and particularly explaining it in the context of actual experience. I mean, where we analyze actual developments, we actually analyze actual policies, we and bring to the fore the crucial role not just of some benign ideal market, but to the way in which powerful economic forces use the structures of systems like capitalism to be able to generate outcomes which have deep implications for the people, and to bring them out in terms of the way in which you actually have the functioning of these economies, the way in which policy is formulated and sort of unfolds, the actual lived experience with the well-being of the people, and the factors underlying it that you need to write about, speak about. And I think there are people doing that, not enough, but there are people doing that. Uh, it's not something which gets you publications in a journal which would allow you to get yourself, I don't know, tenure or whatever it may be. But it's something which has to be done. Yes, I agree with you.
I have nothing to add but to say that the whole package also includes renowned economists like you and many others coming to podcasts and engaging with people, because we get not just thousands of views, sometimes hundreds of thousands of views, and people do understand what economic professors in economics department uh, uh, talk about. Professor Chandrasekhar, this has been such an honor for me to have you on, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to join this.
Hi,
Okay.
my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.